The sun was just breaking over the Montana hills when Helen stepped out onto her front porch, coffee mug in hand. At 48, she had learned to love these quiet morning moments before the day's work began. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wild grass and the distant sound of cattle moving in the pasture. This was her world now, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. 5 years had passed since her husband Tom died in that terrible accident. 5 years since her life turned upside down and she had to decide whether to sell the ranch or fight to keep it. Most people told her she was crazy to try running a cattle operation on her own. A woman alone with a teenage boy, they whispered. She'd lose everything within a year, but Helen was stubborn. This land had been in Tom's family for 3 generations. Their son Jake was only 15 when his father died, but he stood beside her at the funeral and squeezed her hand. "We can do this, Mom," he had whispered. "Dad would want us to keep going." Now Jake was 20 years old, tall and strong like his father had been. He could handle the cattle as well as any man twice his age. Every morning, Helen watched him walk out to the barn with that same determined stride Tom used to have. It made her heart ache and swell with pride at the same time. Their ranch wasn't huge by Montana standards. 500 acres of rolling grassland with a small creek running through the middle. They kept about 200 head of cattle, enough to make a living, but not enough to make them rich. Helen didn't mind. Rich had never been the goal anyway. The house itself was simple but comfortable. Tom had built most of it with his own hands back when they were newlyweds. 2 stories, white wood siding, and a wide front porch that faced west toward the mountains. Helen loved sitting on that porch in the evenings, watching the sky turn pink and orange as the sun went down. Their nearest neighbors, the Johnson family, lived 12 miles down the road. In the city, that would seem far. Out here, it felt just right, close enough to help each other when needed, far enough away to have real privacy. Helen had grown to appreciate the solitude more than she ever expected. Jake seemed content with their isolated life, too. When he graduated high school 2 years ago, the guidance counselor had called Helen with exciting news. Her son had been offered a full scholarship to study engineering at the state university. It was a good opportunity, the kind most parents dream about for their children, but when Helen told Jake about the scholarship, he just shook his head. "I'm not leaving you here alone, Mom," he said firmly. "The ranch needs both of us." Double quotes. Helen had argued with him for weeks. She didn't want him to give up his future for her sake. "Your dad would want you to go to college," she told him. He always said education was the most important thing. "Dad also said family comes first," Jake replied. "This is our family business. Our home. I'm not abandoning it." In the end, Helen stopped pushing. Maybe it was selfish, but she was grateful to have him stay. The work was hard enough with 2 people. Doing it alone would have been nearly impossible. Their days followed a comfortable routine that rarely changed. Up before dawn to check on the cattle and make sure they had enough water. Breakfast together in the kitchen while planning the day's tasks. Mornings were usually spent fixing fences, checking for sick animals, or moving cattle to different pastures. The afternoons brought different challenges depending on the season. Spring meant helping with new calves. Summer was about maintaining equipment and preparing for hay season. Fall brought the stress and excitement of selling cattle at market. Evenings were Helen's favorite time. After dinner, she and Jake would sit on the front porch and talk about their day. Sometimes they discussed practical things like which pasture needed new fencing or whether they should buy a new tractor. Other times they talked about memories of Tom, or Jake's plans for improving the ranch, or simply watched the stars come out in the clear Montana sky. The isolation that had once frightened Helen now felt like a blessing. No traffic noise, no neighbors playing loud music, no city stress. Just the sounds of nature and the satisfaction of honest work. When storms came through, they had only each other to depend on. When equipment broke down, they fixed it themselves or did without until they could afford repairs. Money was always tight, but they managed. Helen had learned to stretch every dollar and waste nothing. She kept a large garden behind the house, growing vegetables to last through the winter. Jake had become skilled at fixing machinery that other people would have thrown away. They raised their own beef and traded with neighbors for pork and chicken. Some people might have called their life boring or lonely. Helen saw it differently. There was peace in knowing exactly what each day would bring. There was comfort in the rhythm of seasons and the predictable needs of animals. There was satisfaction in being truly self-sufficient. Jake seemed to feel the same way. He never complained about missing out on the social life other young men his age enjoyed. He didn't seem interested in dating or going to parties in town. When Helen worried that he was too isolated, he just smiled and said he was happy. "This is real life, Mom," he would tell her. "Not like those people in town who sit in offices all day staring at computers. We're actually doing something that matters." Helen knew he was right. Every morning when she looked out over their land, she felt a deep sense of purpose. They were feeding people, caring for animals, and preserving a way of life that was becoming rare. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was important. The ranch had taught them both valuable lessons over the years. They learned that nature doesn't care about human schedules or convenience. Weather, animals, and equipment would do what they wanted, regardless of plans. They learned to be flexible, patient, and resourceful. Most importantly, they learned they could count on each other no matter what challenges came up. Their relationship had grown stronger through all the difficulties. Jake was no longer just her son, but her partner in running the ranch. They made decisions together and supported each other through tough times. Helen trusted Jake's judgment completely, and he respected her experience and wisdom. As Helen stood on her porch that morning, watching Jake walk toward the barn to start his chores, she felt genuinely content with their life. The ranch was profitable enough to pay the bills and put a little money aside for emergencies. They were healthy and happy. The work was hard but rewarding. She had no way of knowing that this peaceful morning routine was about to change forever. In just a few hours, their quiet, predictable world would be turned upside down by 3 unexpected visitors walking up their dusty road. Their simple life was about to become much more complicated, challenging everything they thought they knew about family, responsibility, and what it means to help others in need. But for now, Helen simply enjoyed the sunrise and the promise of another ordinary day on the ranch she and Jake had worked so hard to save. It was one of those July days when the heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. Helen had finished the morning chores early and decided to tackle the laundry before it got too hot to work outside. She was hanging Jake's work shirts on the clothesline behind the house when something caught her eye in the distance. 3 small figures were walking up their long dirt driveway. At first, Helen thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Nobody ever walked to their ranch. It was too far from the main road, and their driveway alone was nearly a mile long. People who visited always came by truck or car. Helen shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted against the bright sun. The figures were definitely real, and they were definitely walking. As they got closer, she could see they were young people, probably teenagers. They moved slowly, like people who had been walking for a very long time. A wave of concern washed over Helen. This was the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was 40 miles away. How had these kids ended up walking to their ranch? And why did they look so tired? Helen dropped the wet shirt she was holding back into the laundry basket and called toward the barn. "Jake, come here for a minute. We have visitors." Jake emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He had been working on their old tractor, again trying to coax a few more years of life out of the aging machine. When he saw the 3 figures approaching, his expression immediately became serious. "Mom, who are those kids? And why are they walking?" "I don't know," Helen replied, her voice filled with worry. "But they look like they've been traveling for days." As the 3 young people got closer, Helen could see they were all girls, probably between 14 and 17 years old. They wore simple clothes that were dusty from the road, and each carried a worn backpack that looked heavy. Their dark hair and bronze skin suggested they were Native American, though Helen couldn't be sure from which tribe. The oldest girl, who appeared to be the leader of the group, walked slightly ahead of the other 2. She had straight black hair, pulled back in a simple ponytail and serious dark eyes that seemed older than her years. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she held herself with a dignity that impressed Helen immediately. The middle girl looked to be about 15. She stayed close to her older companion, occasionally glancing nervously at the ranch buildings as if she wasn't sure whether they should be there. Her backpack seemed to be giving her trouble, and she kept shifting it from one shoulder to the other. The youngest of the three couldn't have been more than 14. She had the same dark hair as the others but wore it in 2 long braids. Unlike her companions, she seemed curious about everything around her, looking at the cattle in the pasture and the horses in the corral with obvious interest. When the girls reached the front yard, they stopped near the porch where Jake had been working on a broken chair earlier that morning. The oldest girl looked directly at Helen and Jake, her expression careful and respectful. "Excuse me," she said in clear English, though Helen detected a slight accent. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is—" She paused for just a moment as if deciding what to say. "My name is Rose. These are my sisters Anna and Lucy." Helen noticed that Rose didn't give a last name, and something in the girl's hesitation made her wonder if those were even their real names. But she kept these thoughts to herself. "We've been walking for several days," Rose continued. "We're very tired and hungry. We don't have any money, but we're willing to work for food and maybe a place to rest for the night." Helen's heart immediately went out to these girls. They were clearly in some kind of trouble, though she couldn't imagine what. She glanced at Jake, who was studying the 3 visitors with the same concerned expression she probably wore. "Where did you walk from?" Jake asked gently. "The nearest town is pretty far from here." Rose exchanged a quick look with her sisters before answering. "We came from the north. We've been walking for about a week." A week, Helen's mind raced. That meant these girls had been walking through some pretty empty country. Montana had long stretches of land with no towns, no stores, and no help if something went wrong. How had 3 teenage girls managed such a journey on their own? "Are you running away from something?" Helen asked softly. She tried to keep any judgment out of her voice. Whatever these girls were running from, they were clearly desperate. Rose's composure cracked slightly at the question. Her sisters moved closer to her as if seeking protection. The youngest one, Lucy, looked like she might start crying. "We're not in trouble with the law," Rose said quickly. "We haven't done anything wrong, we couldn't stay where we were anymore. It wasn't safe." The pain in Rose's voice told Helen everything she needed to know. These weren't troublemakers or delinquents. They were scared kids who had run away from something terrible. Helen made a decision that would change all of their lives, though she didn't know it at the time. "Come up onto the porch and sit down," she said warmly. "You look like you're about to collapse from the heat. Jake, go get some cold water and maybe some of those sandwiches I made for lunch." Jake nodded and headed toward the house. He understood his mother well enough to know that they would be helping these girls, no matter what their story was. Rose looked surprised by the kindness. "We don't want to be any trouble," she said. "We can work for whatever you give us." "Right. Now you need to rest and get something in your stomachs," Helen replied firmly. "We can talk about work later." The 3 girls climbed the porch steps slowly, their exhaustion obvious in every movement. Helen noticed that their shoes were worn thin and their clothes were dirty from days on the road. Whatever had driven them to make this journey, it must have been serious. As they settled into the porch chairs, Helen got her first good look at their faces. Rose, despite being the oldest, had shadows under her eyes that spoke of worry and responsibility beyond her years. Anna seemed nervous and kept glancing around as if expecting someone to appear. Young Lucy looked the most hopeful of the 3, as if she still believed everything might work out. Jake returned with a pitcher of ice water and glasses, along with a plate of sandwiches Helen had made that morning. The girls' eyes lit up at the sight of food, though they waited politely for permission before taking anything. "Please eat," Helen encouraged them. "You must be starving." The girls ate with careful politeness, but Helen could see they were incredibly hungry. They drank the cold water gratefully, and some color began to return to their faces. As they ate, Helen studied them more closely. Despite their obvious hardship, these were well-raised girls. They said please and thank you. They didn't grab for food, and they cleaned up after themselves. Someone had taught them manners and respect. How old are you girls? Helen asked gently. I'm 17, Rose answered. Anna is 15, and Lucy just turned 14 last month. 14 years old. And walking across Montana. Helen's heart ached thinking about what could have driven such young girls to take such a desperate risk. Jake sat down on the porch steps, his expression thoughtful. Where were you planning to go? He asked. The three girls exchanged glances. Again, Helen was beginning to recognize this as their way of communicating without words. We're not sure, Rose admitted quietly. We just knew we had to leave. We thought maybe we could find work somewhere, or maybe someone who would help us. Helen looked at these three brave, frightened girls sitting on her porch and felt something shift inside her heart. Their quiet, predictable life was about to become much more complicated. But looking at Rose's determined face, Anna's hopeful eyes, and little Lucy's trusting smile, Helen realized she didn't mind at all. 3 weeks had passed since Rose, Anna, and Lucy arrived at the ranch, and Helen was amazed at how quickly they had settled into the rhythm of daily life. What she had expected to be a temporary arrangement was starting to feel surprisingly permanent. Though none of them had actually discussed how long the girls would stay, Rose had turned out to have an incredible gift with horses. On her second day at the ranch, she had approached Thunder, Helen's most difficult stallion. The horse had been injured in a fence accident 2 years ago and had been skittish and aggressive ever since. Even Jake was careful around Thunder, but Rose walked right up to him like they were old friends. Helen had watched from the kitchen window, her heart in her throat, as Rose extended her hand to the temperamental horse. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground, but something in Rose's calm presence seemed to settle him. Within minutes, she was stroking his neck and whispering to him in what sounded like her native language. By the end of the week, Rose was riding Thunder bareback around the pasture like they had been partners for years. Anna had discovered Helen's neglected vegetable garden and asked permission to work on it. The garden had been Tom's project originally, but after he died, Helen had barely managed to keep a few tomato plants alive. Anna seemed to understand plants in a way that amazed Helen. She knew which weeds to pull and which ones were actually helpful. She could tell just by looking at a plant whether it needed more water or less sun. Under Anna's care, the garden began to flourish in ways Helen had never seen. The tomatoes grew fat and red, the beans climbed their poles eagerly, and the squash plants spread across their patch like they owned the place. Anna worked in the garden every morning before the sun got too hot, and Helen often found her there in the evenings too, checking on her plants like a mother watching over children. Little Lucy had attached herself to Jake from the very first day. She followed him everywhere, asking endless questions about ranch work and chattering constantly about everything she saw. At first, Jake seemed a bit overwhelmed by her enthusiasm, but Helen could see he was growing fond of the girl's curiosity and energy. Lucy wanted to learn everything: how to milk the cows, how to fix fence posts, how to tell when a cow was getting sick, how to drive the tractor. Jake patiently answered all her questions and even started teaching her some basic ranch skills. Helen smiled whenever she saw them working together, Jake's serious concentration balanced by Lucy's bright laughter. But despite how well the girls had fitted into their lives, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something important. Sometimes she would catch them having whispered conversations that stopped as soon as she entered the room. Rose often looked worried when she thought no one was watching. Anna jumped whenever she heard an unexpected car on the distant highway. And Lucy, despite her cheerful nature, sometimes had nightmares that left her crying in the middle of the night. Helen's suspicions were confirmed on a hot Thursday afternoon when she saw a dust cloud rising from their driveway. Someone was coming, and they were driving fast. Helen called to Jake, who was working on the barn roof, and watched as he climbed down and stood beside her. The vehicle that pulled into their yard was a white pickup truck with official markings. Helen's stomach tightened as she read the words painted on the side: Tribal Police. Behind her, she heard quick footsteps as the three girls came out of the house, probably drawn by the sound of the truck. The reaction of the girls told Helen Everything she needed to know. Rose went completely still, like a deer sensing danger. Anna grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her younger sister close. Lucy, who was usually fearless, suddenly looked very small and frightened. A tall man in uniform stepped out of the truck. He was probably in his 40s, with graying black hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Despite his official appearance, something about his manner seemed gentle rather than threatening. "Good afternoon," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. "I'm Officer Red Hawk with the Crow Nation Police. I'm looking for 3 young ladies who went missing from our reservation about a month ago." Helen felt Rose tense behind her, but the girl stepped forward bravely. "I'm Rose," she said quietly. "These are my sisters, Anna and Lucy." Officer Red Hawk's expression softened when he saw the girls. "Rose, Anna, Lucy," he said gently. "A lot of people have been very worried about you. Your grandmother has been beside herself with fear. Is he in jail?" Rose asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Red Hawk nodded. "Yes, he is. Robert has been arrested and charged. He's not going anywhere for a very long time." Helen saw Rose's shoulders sag with relief, as if she had been carrying a heavy weight that had suddenly been lifted. Anna started crying quietly, and Lucy buried her face against Rose's shoulder. "Who is Robert?" Helen asked, though she was beginning to understand. Officer Red Hawk looked at the girls, waiting for their permission to explain. Rose nodded slowly. "Robert was their stepfather," Officer Red Hawk said carefully. "Their mother died 2 years ago, and Robert became their legal guardian. The girls reported him for hurting them. But before we could arrest him, he found out about the report and threatened them. He said he would make sure they disappeared if they ever told anyone else." Helen felt sick to her stomach. These brave girls had been running from an abuser who had threatened their lives. No wonder they had been willing to walk across Montana rather than stay where they were. "So Rose took her sisters and left in the middle of the night, Officer," Red Hawk continued. "We've been searching for them ever since. When Robert was finally arrested last week, we put out word that the girls were safe to come home." "But we don't have a home," Rose said, her voice breaking. "Mom's house belongs to Robert now. Grandmother lives in a 1-room apartment with our cousins. There's no room for us." Officer Red Hawk's expression grew sad. "The tribal council is working on finding you girls a place to stay. There are some foster families who might be able to take you, but they don't want to split us up," Anna finished. "Most families can't take 3 girls at once." Helen felt her heart breaking for these children. They had been through so much already, and now they faced the possibility of being separated from each other. Rose had protected her sisters and kept them together through everything, but the system might force them apart anyway. Jake spoke up for the first time. "What if they stayed here?" Everyone turned to look at him. Helen felt surprised but not shocked. She had been thinking the same thing herself, though she hadn't had the courage to say it out loud. "We have plenty of room," Jake continued. "They're already helping with the ranch work. They seem happy here." Officer Red Hawk looked thoughtful. "That would require legal arrangements. Guardianship papers, background checks, approval from the tribal council and the state. It's not impossible, but it would be complicated." Helen looked at the 3 girls standing together on her porch. Rose with her quiet dignity and her gift with horses. Anna with her gentle nature and her magic touch with growing things. Lucy with her endless questions and bright laughter that had brought so much life to their quiet home. "How complicated?" Helen asked. Officer Red Hawk smiled for the first time since he had arrived. "Are you seriously considering this, Mrs. Thompson?" Helen looked at Jake, who nodded encouragingly. Then she looked at the girls, who were watching her with expressions of desperate hope. "Yes," she said firmly, "I think I am." The peaceful life she and Jake had known was definitely over. But looking at these 3 girls who had walked into their lives carrying nothing but courage and hope, Helen realized she was ready for whatever came next. That evening, after Officer Red Hawk had left with promises to return the following week with paperwork and more information, Helen found herself sitting alone on the front porch. The girls had gone to bed early, exhausted from the emotional day. Jake was inside making phone calls, trying to get information about what becoming a legal guardian would actually involve. Helen stared out at the darkening sky and wondered what she had gotten herself into. 3 hours ago, her biggest worry had been whether they could afford to fix the barn roof before winter. Now she was seriously considering taking legal responsibility for 3 traumatized teenagers. The practical concerns were overwhelming. 3 more people meant 3 times the food costs, 3 times the clothing expenses, 3 times the medical bills. They would need bigger bedrooms, more furniture, and probably a larger vehicle. The girls would need school supplies, winter, coats, and dozens of other things Helen hadn't even thought of yet. Then there were the legal complications Officer Red Hawk had mentioned. Background checks, home inspections, court appearances, and mountains of paperwork. Helen had never dealt with anything more complicated than renewing her driver's license. The thought of navigating the foster care system and tribal bureaucracy made her head spin, but the financial and legal challenges weren't what really worried her. What scared Helen most was the possibility that she might fail these girls. They had already been hurt by adults who were supposed to protect them. What if she made mistakes? What if she couldn't give them what they needed? What if she somehow made their lives worse instead of better? Jake came out onto the porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to his mother and sat down in the chair beside her. "I talked to Mrs. Patterson at the county social services office," he said. "She's going to send us some information about becoming foster parents. She said it's not easy, but it's not impossible either." Helen sipped her coffee and tried to organize her thoughts. "Jake, this isn't just about paperwork and money. These girls have been through terrible things. They're going to need counseling, special attention, probably medical care. I don't know if I'm qualified to handle all that." Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars that were beginning to appear in the clear Montana sky. "Mom, do you remember what you told me after Dad died? When everyone was telling you to sell the ranch and move to town?" Helen smiled, despite her worries. "I told you that sometimes the most important things in life aren't easy or practical." "Right, you said we had to do what felt right in our hearts even if other people thought we were crazy." Jake turned to look at his mother. "What does your heart tell you about Rosanna and Lucy?" Helen didn't have to think about her answer. Over the past 3 weeks, she had watched these girls transform from frightened runaways into confident, happy young women. Rose's smile when she worked with the horses, Anna's pride when she showed off her thriving garden, Lucy's infectious laughter as she helped Jake with chores. These moments had filled Helen's heart in ways she hadn't expected. "My heart tells me they belong here," she said softly. "But Jake, this decision affects you too. You're only 20 years old. Most guys your age are out having fun, not helping raise 3 teenage girls. If we do this, your life is going to change completely." Jake grinned. "Mom, my life already changed completely when they got here. Have you seen how much work Anna has gotten done in the garden? We're going to have enough vegetables to last all winter and probably enough left over to sell at the farmer's market. And Rose has Thunder acting like a completely different horse. And Lucy ... double quote," he paused, his expression growing fond. "Lucy makes every day more interesting. She asks questions I never thought of and notices things I walk right past." Helen felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Her son had grown up so much since his father died, but she had never been more proud of the man he was becoming. "Besides," Jake continued, "think about what Dad would say if he were here. Remember how he always talked about helping people when they needed it most? Remember how he used to say that family isn't just about blood? It's about who you choose to care for?" Tom would have loved these girls, Helen realized. He would have been teaching Lucy how to drive the tractor and helping Anna plant more vegetables. He would have been amazed by Rose's way with the horses. And he definitely would have told Helen to stop worrying about practical details and focus on what was right. "There's something else," Jake said. "I've been thinking about going back to school, maybe taking some online courses, but I was worried about leaving you here alone to handle everything. If Rose, Anna, and Lucy stay, you won't be alone anymore. Rose is already better with the horses than I am, and Anna could probably grow enough food to feed half the county. Helen looked at her son with surprise. You want to go back to school? I've been thinking about it for a while. Maybe studying agriculture or veterinary science. Something that would help me run the ranch better. Jake shrugged. I didn't want to mention it because I knew you needed help here. But if we're going to have more people anyway. The idea of Jake continuing his education made Helen happier than she had felt in weeks. She had always regretted that he had given up his scholarship to stay with her. If taking in the girls would somehow make it possible for Jake to pursue his dreams too, then maybe this crazy idea wasn't so crazy after all. What about money? Helen asked. Officer Red Hawk mentioned that foster families receive some financial support, but I don't know how much. And there will be so many extra expenses. Actually, I had an idea about that too, Jake said. Anna's garden is producing more vegetables than we can possibly eat. And Rose thinks she could train horses for other people if they brought them. Here, Lucy is already talking about raising chickens for eggs. Maybe having them here could actually help us make more money, not just spend it. Helen had to admit that Jake might be right. The girls had already proven they were hard workers and quick learners. Rose's skill with horses was genuinely impressive, and Anna seemed to have inherited some kind of natural farming instinct. Even Lucy, despite being the youngest, had shown herself to be surprisingly capable and eager to learn. More importantly, Helen realized that she had been happier these past 3 weeks than she had been since Tom died. The house felt alive again. There was laughter at dinner, conversation in the evenings, and a sense of purpose that went beyond just keeping the ranch running. There's one more thing we need to consider, Helen said. What if the girls don't want to stay? What if they decide they'd rather go back to the reservation or live with other relatives? Jake smiled. Mom, have you seen the way they look at this place? The way Rose talks to the horses, the way Anna fusses over her plants, the way Lucy chatters about all the things she wants to learn. They love it here as much as we love having them. Helen finished her coffee and set the cup down on the porch. Railing, the night air was getting cooler, and she could hear the cattle settling down for the night in the distance. This was still the same peaceful ranch where she and Jake had built their quiet life together. But it was also about to become something entirely different. Okay, she said finally. Let's do it. Let's figure out how to make this official. Jake reached over and squeezed his mother's hand. Dad would be proud of us, Helen squeezed back. I think you're right. Inside the house, she could hear soft voices as the girls talked quietly before falling asleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and complicated decisions. But tonight, Helen felt more certain than she had about anything since Tom's death. Their family was about to grow, and somehow she knew everything was going to work out exactly as it should. 6 months later, Helen stood in exactly the same spot where she had first seen 3 tired girls walking up their dusty road. But now she was watching those same girls running toward the bright yellow school bus, their backpacks bouncing as they called goodbye over their shoulders. See you tonight, Mom, Rose shouted as she climbed onto the bus stop. Mom. Helen still felt a little flutter in her chest every time one of the girls called her that. It had started with Lucy about 2 months ago. Anna had picked it up a few weeks later. Rose, being the most cautious of the 3, had only started using the word recently. But when she did, Helen's eyes always filled with happy tears. The legal process of becoming their official guardian had been more complicated than officer Red Hawk had warned them about. There had been countless forms to fill out, background checks that seemed to take forever, and home inspections that left Helen cleaning the house like she was expecting the president to visit. The worst part had been the court hearing where a stern judge questioned whether a widow and her young son could really handle 3 traumatized teenagers. Helen had sat in that courtroom wearing her best dress, her hands shaking as she tried to explain why she believed the girls belonged with them. Rose had asked to speak to the judge herself. Standing up in that intimidating courtroom, she had told the judge about how Helen had given them food and shelter when they were desperate strangers. She talked about how Jake had patiently taught Lucy to drive the tractor and how Anna's garden was feeding their entire family. She explained that for the first time in years, she and her sisters felt truly safe. "Your Honor," Rose had said in her clear, confident voice, "Helen and Jake didn't just give us a place to live. They gave us back our family." The judge had approved the guardianship that same day. Money had been tighter than Helen expected, even with the foster care payments and the extra income the girls were bringing in. Rose had started training horses for neighbors, just as Jake had predicted. Word had spread quickly about her gift with difficult animals, and now she had a waiting list of people wanting her help with their horses. Anna's garden had become legendary in their small community. She was growing more vegetables than their family could eat, and Helen had started selling the extra produce at a farmer's market 2 towns over. Anna had also started giving gardening advice to other families, teaching them her natural methods for growing healthy plants without expensive chemicals. Even Lucy was contributing to the family income, though in a way none of them had expected. Her endless curiosity and chattering personality had caught the attention of their local newspaper editor, who asked her to write a weekly column about life on a ranch from a teenager's perspective. Lucy's articles were funny, heartwarming, and surprisingly insightful. The column had become so popular that papers in 3 other towns were now publishing it too, but the money, while important, wasn't what made Helen happiest about their expanded family. What filled her heart was the way the house felt alive again. Dinner conversations that lasted for hours as everyone shared stories about their day. Evenings when they all gathered on the front porch, Jake strumming the guitar he had learned to play, while the girls sang songs they remembered from their childhood. Jake had indeed gone back to school, just as he had hoped. He was taking online courses in agricultural science and veterinary medicine, studying at the kitchen table in the evenings while the girls did their homework. Helen often found herself smiling as she watched all 4 of her children bent over their books, helping each other with difficult problems. The girls had adapted to school better than Helen had dared to hope. Rose was taking advanced classes and talking about studying veterinary medicine in college. Her teachers said she had a natural understanding of animal behavior that was remarkable for someone her age. Anna had joined the school's environmental club and was teaching other students about sustainable farming methods. Lucy had become the star of the drama club, her natural storytelling ability making her perfect for the stage, but it hadn't all been easy. There had been difficult nights when one of the girls woke up from nightmares about their past. There had been days when Rose felt overwhelmed by the responsibility she still felt for her younger sisters. There had been moments when Anna withdrew into herself, afraid to trust that this happiness would last. And there had been times when Lucy's cheerful mask slipped, revealing the scared little girl underneath. Helen had learned to recognize the signs when one of the girls was struggling. She had found ways to offer comfort without pushing too hard. Sometimes it was a quiet conversation on the porch. Sometimes it was working together in silence on ranch chores. Sometimes it was simply being present, letting them know they weren't alone. The girls had also taught Helen and Jake things they never expected to learn. Rose had shown them traditional methods of working with horses that her grandfather had taught her, techniques that were gentler and more effective than anything they had known before. Anna had shared knowledge about plants and farming that had been passed down through generations of her people. Lucy had brought stories and songs that filled their evenings with laughter and wonder. Their little ranch had become a bridge between 2 worlds, blending Helen and Jake's practical Montana farming with the rich cultural traditions the girls brought from their tribal heritage. They celebrated both Thanksgiving and the traditional harvest festivals the girls remembered from their childhood. They honored both Christian and Native American spiritual practices, finding ways to respect all the beliefs that mattered to their family members. The community had embraced their unusual family more warmly than Helen had expected. Neighbors, who had watched Helen struggle as a widow, were impressed by how well she and Jake were caring for the 3 girls. The local school principal had told Helen that Rose, Anna, and Lucy were among the most well-adjusted and motivated students she had ever known. "Whatever you're doing at home," the principal had said, "keep doing it. These girls are thriving." "Officer," Red Hawk still visited occasionally, officially to check on the girls' welfare, but really because he had become a friend to their family. He often stayed for dinner, sharing news from the reservation and updates about the girls' extended family. There, the girls' grandmother had visited twice, bringing traditional gifts and expressing her gratitude to Helen for giving her granddaughters a stable, loving home. As Helen watched the school bus disappear around the bend that morning, she reflected on how much their lives had changed. The quiet, predictable existence she and Jake had known was definitely gone forever. In its place was something messier, louder, more complicated, and infinitely more rewarding. Their ranch was no longer just a place where two people worked hard to make a living. It had become a real home where five people who weren't related by blood had chosen to become a family. It was a place where three girls who had once walked desperate and alone down a dusty road now ran confidently toward their futures. Knowing they had a home to return to every evening. Helen smiled as she picked up the coffee cup Jake had left on the porch railing and headed inside to start her day. There would be animals to feed, chores to do, and probably some crisis or adventure that Lucy would create before dinner time. Tonight there would be homework to supervise, stories to share, and plans to make for the weekend. It wasn't the peaceful life she had once thought she wanted. It was so much better,